Now, I don't know how many of you people here follow American basketball. Why am I talking about American basketball? Oh, I do? Excellent. Okay, a little while back, the owner of one of the teams, he was quoted as saying, "You go to Israel, the blacks are just treated like dogs." No one really inquired into this. None of the American newspapers asked the question, is this true? What's this about? They just glossed over it. They focused on his racism, but not on Israel's racism. And the people he was talking about are manifold, because there's not only one kind of black people in Israel. There are many African communities in Israel. Some Jewish, some Christian, some Muslim, some animist, some Palestinian. And so there are many different groups. I cannot talk about all of them today. I could speak for many, many hours about the different communities. But today I'm going to focus. First, I will speak just for one moment about this community, because this community is an African community that has Western privilege. So I want you to understand the difference between the levels of privilege that each community has. So I'm sure there's also some African Americans who play on Swedish teams in the basketball league. Is that the case? And it's the same in Israel. So there are African Americans who come from the United States of America to Israel, and they play on Israeli teams. Those are Africans with Western privilege. They have Western passports when they arrive. And they have high salaries, so they have high incomes. Now, the chief rabbi of Israel, the first day that he is elected to be the chief rabbi of all of Israel, he says, "What do you care if the N-word that gets paid by Tel Aviv beats the N-word that gets paid by Greece?" He was telling the religious youth, why do you care about basketball? Why are you involved? What does it matter to you? It's just a bunch of black people. What do you care who wins? This is his way of saying, don't spend your time in sports, spend your time studying the Bible. But does it by way of insulting black people. This is the chief rabbi of Israel on his first day in office. Even if you have Western privilege, even if you are a rich black man who speaks English, this is still how you are spoken of by the highest officials in the country. This is the first sports commissioner in the history of Israel. Upon entering his position as the first sports commissioner at this first public meeting, he says, there are those who didn't like, he was talking about the championship team that just won the championship in Israel. There are those who didn't like that you played with 5 N-word for much of the championship game. It's no fun to throw around these disgusting terms like it's just normal conversation. This is par for the course in Israel. Again, the richest ones experience this. Moti Sasson, this is the mayor of a suburb of Tel Aviv. He says, I don't want to see foreigners. If you want to see the N-word, there's the NBA. The mayor of a city in Israel. This is the level of racism, again, to the richest of the black people in Israel. Now, of course, I just told you that to compare and contrast. There is, of course, another community in Israel that does not have Western privilege. This group of Africans did not come with a Western passport or with large sums of money. These are the Habesha Jews, the Ethiopian Jews. Now, many people here have probably heard a story that they've been told over time about the Ethiopian Jews. What's the story? The story I'm sure you've heard is that the state of Israel was noble, and they decided to help those poor Habesha Jews who were suffering in Ethiopia. And they graciously and magnanimously sent airplanes to land in Africa and collect these Ethiopian Jews and bring them back to Israel, Bring them to Israel, and from then on, they have lived the rest of their lives in Israel as Israeli citizens. This is the story that the Israeli government tells, and they tell it as they are the hero, as the government itself is the hero, and the Ethiopian Jews are the poor, hapless victims that have no agency in their lives. They were just poor, suffering, and lucky enough to be saved. What Ethiopian Jews in Israel call the savior narrative. This is how it is taught in schools. Now, there's one problem with this savior narrative that the government teaches, and that it is the exact opposite of the reality. Literally the exact opposite. And I will tell you what I mean by that. This is a story that I reported in the last couple of years. No Israeli paper wanted to publish it. I had to go to a Nigerian paper to publish it. 6 months after I published it, Israel Channel 1 then published the story. Once I'd already exposed it, then the mainstream news started covering it. But at that time, no one was discussing it. And this is the story. So, if you ask the Israeli government, well, there's something wrong with your story. Israel, what year was the State of Israel founded? Anyone know the answer to this question? If you're a history buff, perhaps?
47.
67 was the year that Israel conquered the West Bank. So that was but it was, as Meron pointed out, actually 20 years earlier, 1948 was the year that Israel was established. So, if Israel was established, in fact, in 1948, and at that time, the government rushed to bring in the Jews from Iraq, the Jews from Poland, the Jews from Yemen, the Jews from Morocco, from all around the world, immediately after the State of Israel is established, the government sends agents to help facilitate the immigration of Jewish people from throughout the world. Well, if the state was established in 1948, why did it only start bringing in Habesha Jews in 1984, several decades after the fact? What's wrong here? Why are the black Jews the last ones to come and only decades later? Well, if you ask the government, they say, well, we didn't have good relationship with the government of Ethiopia, with Mengistu, so therefore it wasn't logistically possible. And you had a good relationship with communist Russia? And you had good relationships with the government in Iraq? With the government in Morocco? You were able to bring in those Jews despite no relationship with those governments. Well, the biggest disproof is that this whole story of Israel sending planes to Ethiopia to land to pick up those Jews and bring them to Israel, that it could only happen in 1984. Well, it turns out that the same thing happened in 1972. The Israeli government, these are photographs, sent jumbo jets just the same way to Ethiopia. They landed in the deserts of Ethiopia and in the Afari region, and they collected Ethiopians onto the airplanes, and they brought those Ethiopians back to Israel. And since then, those Ethiopians have been living in Israel. They didn't wait till 1984. They started in 1972. But those Ethiopians they brought to Israel in 1972, they weren't Ethiopian Jews, actually. They also were not Ethiopian Christians or Ethiopian Muslims, or even Ethiopian humans at all. In fact, they were Ethiopian donkeys. Donkeys! This is not a joke. It's a sad, sick joke, actually. What happened was, why would more than 10 years before the Israeli government was willing to bring Ethiopian Jews to Israel, why did they bring Ethiopian donkeys to Israel? And the reason is because of this man. He was one of a very active man in the Israeli power structure. He had a vision. He was like a nature conservationist. Okay? He wanted to protect the Israeli environment, the flora, the fauna, to preserve the heritage. But he had an idea that was ideological. It was not purely ecological. It wasn't purely environmental. He had another motive. He said, if we look in the Bible, we look in the Torah and the Talmud, we see the names of animals. And this animal, blah, 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 and this animal, blah, blah, blah. It lists the different animals that lived in the land of Israel in the time of the Bible. And they thought, well, if we, now, of course, this is the year 2000, or almost 2000, 1948, 1950s, 60s. Many of these animals no longer exist. All these centuries have gone by. Many of these animals have gone extinct. Of course, Since industrial civilization, the advent of the rifle, and other reasons, many of those animals were just hunted to extinction in the last 2,000 years. So many of the animals from the Bible era no longer exist in the land of Israel. Now he thought, but if we find those animals living somewhere else in the world, we can buy them and then bring them back to Israel, and then we can show the world, look, the animals that lived in the Bible, in the time of the Bible, are now once again living in the land of the Bible. And just as the land appears to be filled with the same animals at the time of the Bible, so should the land be ruled by the same people that ruled the land in the time of the Bible. So this is his ideology. If we bring back those ancient extinct animals to Israel, then it will support the ideology of our regime by saying, you Jews deserve to rule the land of Israel. So this was his reason. So the government of Israel approved this plan. And in fact, I visited those donkeys. They're still, well, not they themselves, they have died. Donkeys don't live 40, 50, 60 years. But the children and the grandchildren of those donkeys are still living in the same nature reserve in Israel. That's great, but it's not true at all. At all. The government of Israel could not bring Jews to Israel. In fact, just the opposite. At that time, as you know, before Mengistu ruled Ethiopia, there was Haile Selassie, the emperor, and Israel and Haile Selassie had very close relations. And in fact, the Israeli government had ambassadors serving in Addis Ababa. There was then, and there is now, an Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa, and here is the Israeli ambassador at that time presenting his credentials to the emperor, Hananino. And at that time, what Hananino said, and we now have the documents, he wrote back to the government in Jerusalem. He said, we can't let those Ethiopian Habesha Jews come to Israel, because if they did, it would raise hopes of immigrating for thousands of primitive, illiterate, sick, oppressed people that we will never have capacity for. This is the Israeli ambassador writing back to the government. We can't allow these Habesha Jews to come to Israel. Okay? So what would happen is, if a Christian Ethiopian or wanted to come to Israel on a pilgrimage to see the holy sites in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, in Nazareth, then he would just, or she would just come to the embassy in Addis, say, hello, I would like a visa to travel to Israel. They say, okay, no problem. Here's your visa, there you go. Salamat. But if you were a Jew in Ethiopia and you wanted to go to Israel, you would also go into the embassy and you would ask, they said, okay, no problem, we'll give you the visa. Give us $600. So the Jews, they would charge them, of course, that amount of money was way beyond the means of the average Ethiopian at that time, especially the Jews of Ethiopia who were living in rural areas. And so it was on purpose to make it impossible for them, because the government knew that if those Habesha Jews came to Israel, they might want to stay. The Christians just wanted to visit and go back home. The Jews might want to stay, and many did. And the government only began changing its policy when? When did the Israeli government begin changing its policy? In the mid-1970s, the governments of the world start to realize how racist the regime is. And they start saying in the United Nations that Israel is a racist state. Not because of its treatment of Habesha people, but because of its treatment of Arab people, of the Palestinians. And because of this, in the United Nations, they pass a resolution in 1975 saying Zionism is racism. The ideology of the State of Israel is based upon a fundamentally racist principle that the land should only belong to people of one ethnic group. And so when the United Nations decides and announces that, in their opinion, Israel is a racist state, then Israeli government officials say, how can we change this? How can we fix our public relations? And they think, well, the way that we can do it is if we... Remember those black Jews we've been trying to keep out of the country for all these decades? Well, now, if we just allow them in, well, it's a small, it's a price we have to pay, unfortunately, but if we allow these black Jews to come, then we can use them as props, as fig leaves, to then say, look, we're not racist. How can you call us racist? We've got black Jews, we got white Jews, yellow Jews, black Jews, orange Jews, pink Jews, so how can you possibly call us racist? And so, in other words, nowadays, when people say, don't call Israelis racist, we have black Jews, understand that the reason those black Jews were even brought to Israel in the first place was for that very purpose, as utilitarian, to be able to use as a prop and say, we're not, what? We're racist? We're not racist. So that's the story. Now, of course, it wasn't that, once they made that decision, it didn't mean that the racism vanished into thin air. The government's racist policies towards Habesha people continued and amplified once they came to the country. So, for example, we've started to learn in recent years that as a condition to be allowed to move to the country, Habesha women were coerced into taking birth control shots, needles that made them incapable for temporary periods of time. Temporary means like months at a time. Instead of taking like a birth control pill every day, they would take a shot. And the shot would mean for several months that they would not be able to conceive. And of course, every person, man, woman, should have the option, the control over their own body to decide if, in fact, they want to get pregnant. I believe that's a human right. You should be able to decide if you want to get pregnant or not. These women were not given the right to make that decision. They were told, you want to move to Israel? You have to take this shot. You have to have your ability to conceive stripped from you if you want to live your life in Israel. It goes without saying that none of the Jewish women from Russia, or Jewish women from America, or Jewish women from Brazil, or Jewish women from any other country in the world, none of them were forced to have these shots. Only the Jewish Habesha women. And of course, this wasn't just theoretical. In the years that followed, in fact, the birth rate of the Habesha Jewish community in Israel dropped very significantly. The amount of children they had. And you would see it because all of a sudden the kindergarten classes were now half full. So it was very obvious to people. This is not in dispute. This is starting to come out in recent years, and it just piles on. I could speak just several hours about the Jews the Habesha Jews in Israel and the racism towards them. Of course, that's not the main reason we're here today, but it was important for me to explain to you the background so you realize that the racism and the troubles that refugees in Israel experience is not only because of their being refugees, it's not only because they're not Jews, it's also because of their blackness. And so it's important for me to show you other black African groups in Israel and how they're treated by the government. Of course, in recent years, you have these Habesha Jews realizing how racist their treatment has been, understanding that their mothers were forced to take these birth control shots, understanding that they have been sectioned off into different housing areas and put in different schools so that, white Jews who don't want to live in the same neighborhoods as them or send their children to the same schools as them would not have to do so. So people have been starting to take to the streets, especially the youth. Of course, the first generation, they feel so indebted to the government that they are afraid to open their mouths, But the younger generation, they know they were born there. Why should I have to be treated any less respectfully than anybody else? This is my right, and they're right, of course. And so the youth are starting to protest the racism. They're protesting the police brutality that they face, how police over-police their neighborhoods, and they know that they can get away with it because they're just black. So if you want to take out your anger and you're a policeman, you know that you can go into an Habesha neighborhood and beat up an Habesha boy and nothing will come of it. So this is why you have the masses in the streets. There's no famous leaders amongst the Habesha youth. Okay? I happen to know I've interviewed some of the leaders, they're great people, but it's not that there's a big organizing community there. It didn't have to be, because every person felt it. As soon as a viral video comes out of an Abesha boy or girl being beaten by the cops, it brought everyone out to the street because everyone knew. Either they knew from their own experience, or their brother, or their uncle, or their father, or their son, or their nephew. Everyone knew someone that this had happened to already, that this police brutality had affected them. So this is why you have so many people taking to the streets. Now, of course, it was very impressive. They shut down whole highways. This is the biggest highway in Israel. Okay, as you can see, they shut down the whole highway in Tel Aviv for traffic. It was very impressive, when they finally stood up and said enough is enough. It was exciting that people had the courage to come out. The problem is that, when they came out to protest the police brutality, then, of course, the government responded with more police brutality. And so you had methods of crowd control that aren't ever used in Israel. Okay? When white Jews protest in the streets, for whatever reason, if they don't want to go to the army or because they want this or that, it doesn't matter. They are very, very, very light. Comparatively, they're very light with their methods of force. But when the Abesha people protest, they treat them almost like Palestinians. Okay? The same treatment the Palestinian people receive in the West Bank when they protest. All right? Now, Abesha people start to experience this on the streets of Tel Aviv. And then they start wondering, well, if we don't deserve it, and we're getting beaten like this, maybe the Palestinians don't deserve it either. Maybe all this time the government has been lying to us, telling us, Palestinians deserve the violence we give them. Unfortunately, when people were protesting in the streets, I can't say that the Israeli people woke up. This picture kind of reflects that. You see, the streets are filled with Abesha youth, demanding their dignity, and people continuing to go about their daily lives and sipping their espressos, because it didn't affect them. Sadly, that remains the case, that the demands of the youth have gone unanswered. Now, why am I showing you these pictures? As soon as you see the beginnings of the resistance of black folk in Israel, as soon as African refugees start protesting the racism against them, as soon as African Jews start protesting the racism against them, you see, once again, the Israeli government and its allies come with a propaganda campaign. And what it looks like is, because until that point, you had no examples of a black person in Israel winning any competition or, being the victor of any contest. But all of a sudden, as soon as black people start to stand up and protest, all of a sudden you have a woman wins the Israeli Idol competition, a black Jewish woman. And all of a sudden, the Big Brother competition on Tel Aviv, the Israeli version of Big Brother, the winner is a black Jewish woman. The same year, all of a sudden, never happened in all of Israel's history, but all of a sudden, the same year, with all this oppression and protests going on, the winner of the beauty contest of Miss Israel is a black Jewish woman. Never happened before. All of a sudden, in 1 year, boom, 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 boom. I wonder why that is. And so, of course, Now, so what they do, the people who promote the state of Israel, they take, because the woman who won that beauty contest, obviously she's a professional model, and of course they picked someone who was not only a model, but someone who had served in the Israeli army, right? So therefore it could be used as an example of patriotism. And of course, not just serving in any capacity, not just pushing pencils, but someone who had served in an armed capacity with weaponry. And they make her the beauty queen of Israel. Now, once that's the case, they take a photo of her modeling it, zoom in on her breasts, to focus on that, and then they write a tagline. This is what a Zionist looks like. and they start promoting this on social media so that white Jews living in other parts of the world will then have a tool with which they can use to defend Israel from criticism. You call us racist? You call someone who is Zionist a racist, but this is what a Zionist looks like. Aren't you attracted to her? Ah, you're attracted to her. Well, if you're attracted to her, maybe some of those feelings of attraction can be siphoned off to the state of Israel. Perhaps you will start to feel more warmly about the state of Israel. Now, the thing is, having a black person as a beauty queen, does that mean there's no racism? I mean, Vanessa Williams became the beauty queen of the United States in the 80s, right? Does that mean there's no more racism in the United States because a black woman became the Miss USA? I mean, we still have Rodney King after that, right? No one said there's no more racism because Vanessa Williams is Miss USA. You know, they say, oh, we now have black people in the Israeli army. Abesha people in the Israeli army. How can we be racist? I got news for you. In the United States, there were black people serving as soldiers in the American army 150 years ago. Okay, you're trying to tell me there's been no racism in the US for 150 years? Even 75 years ago, you had black men serving in the American Air Force. With all of this, you're trying to tell me there's been no racism in the US in 75 years. And yes, it's true. There are, in fact, Habesha people serving in the Israeli parliament. Let's admit it. Not anymore. At this time, it was 2 people. Now it's 1 person. Then it was 2. Again, I got news for you. Going back 150 years, there were dozens of black men serving in the American Congress, okay? And no one in their right mind would claim that there has been no racism in the US for 150 years. No. So please, let's give that idea a rest. It's pathetic. Yes, it's true, there has been in our lifetimes a black president in the US, and we still have to live with Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and all the other stories of all the other young black men who were the victims of murderous state-sponsored racism, anti-blackness. So please spare us. Now, that woman, that beauty queen, that Miss Israel, because again, she's being sent around the world to be an ambassadress of the state of Israel, to promote it. And when she came to the United States, she gave an interview. She said, a lot of the refugees are not refugees. In Tel Aviv, you can't walk around because there's rape and violence. Okay? Now we're talking about the Eritreans, and we're talking about the Sudanese and the South Sudanese, and all the other Africans who have migrated to Israel in the last decade. And this is the group of people that I've mainly come to talk to you about today. So first of all, thank you for just bearing with me this whole time so I can give you the introduction so you understand the context of anti-blackness in Israel. Of course, it's just the tip of the spear, but at least to give you a basic grounding. So this woman who, again, is promoting Israel in the world, even she, when asked, we heard about some racism against refugees. Don't listen to what you hear. Israel's no racist place. Those refugees you hear about, they're rape-fugees. A lot of refugees, you can't walk around because there's rape and violence. Now this is the image that they're trying to put on black people. That black people are incorrigible rapists and murderers. That they're inherently, maybe, I guess she's black too, so maybe not all blacks, just the non-Jewish blacks. That group, she participates in the racist incitement against them. Now, it's funny to me. Sad funny, So this whole discourse about these Africans are savage, bloodthirsty rapists, and therefore we need to protect our young Jewish defenseless women from these savage African attackers. The thing is, it's playing with fire, and there sadly is a huge, huge, huge problem in Israel with rape culture. Huge. Rape culture is a massive problem. Now, just to give you an example of what I mean, only in the last couple of years, I'm not going back to the beginning of the 2010s, I'm not going back to 2000, literally just in the last couple of years, the people who have been either accused or charged or convicted of sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, crimes, just in the last couple of years. This mayor, this mayor, this mayor, this mayor, this member of Knesset, this member of Knesset, this member of Knesset, this member of Knesset. Okay? This CEO of a bank, Israel's biggest bank, this, the CEO of one of Israel's largest corporations, this dean of a university in Israel, this dean of a university in Israel, just in the last couple of years, okay? And all around Netanyahu himself, he's surrounded by accused sex criminals, okay? This is his driver, who has gone to jail now for raping dozens of women and girls hundreds of times, all while he was Netanyahu's personal driver. His spokesperson accused of sexually assaulting a woman. His chief of staff accused of, in Netanyahu's office, filming under the skirts of women serving in the office. This chief of staff accused of sexual harassments, and then, after Netanyahu was a little bit embarrassed, he let him go. And then he comes back. Every time someone is accused, so at first he's like, okay, it's kind of embarrassing, we'll let the guy go. Then, a couple months later, he brings him back into the office to work in another capacity. Now this man is accused by another woman of the same crime. So, repeated sex offenders right in Netanyahu's inner circle. Okay? Now, just in the last couple of years, the list of top Israeli cops. Now, when I say top cops, I don't mean, he got an award, he was commended, he was an outstanding officer. I'm talking about chief of police of a major city in Israel, or the chief of a division of the national police force, like the chief of all drug enforcement officials in Israel, the chief of all this department. So just in the last couple of years, the top police officers that were, again, either accused or investigated or charged or convicted of sex crimes. This top cop, this top cop, this, and this top cop. And this top cop, who is the chief of police of Jerusalem, and when he was charged in court and the court was deliberating over his crimes, what was his defense? What did he say in response? He said that what he did was in keeping with the conventional norms accepted by the police. It was routine and common. Why are you getting mad at me? Everyone does it. All the police do this. Okay? This is how Israel's police, who are responsible for protecting our women from attack, this is how they treat our women. So yes, there is a big problem in Israel. Rape culture is a huge problem. A massive problem of endemic proportions. The government must treat it like the emergency that it is. Okay? But the problem is not perpetuated by African people. Okay? It's distinctly native Israeli problem. It does not affect any community. There's no community that is not touched by it. There is rape in the African community, in the Arab community, in the Asian community, in the Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and if we care about our women, we need to fight it on every front. That's ABC. But instead, they just want to blame the problem on black people and not have to deal with it. And it's not just the leaders, sickeningly as it is. There are views in society that support this. So they did a poll recently and they found that 20% of Israeli men admit to having committed rape. Okay, admit. And 61% say that forcing a person to have sex isn't rape if they're an acquaintance. What does this mean? So, of course, if you force anyone into sex, that's rape. But what they're saying, in their minds, it's only rape if you're hiding in the bushes somewhere, and you're waiting, and then someone walks by, and then you jump on them, and then you rape them. Only that is rape. But as long as you know, oh, hello, nice to meet you, so-and-so, we've already had a conversation once, so now we're acquaintances. As long as you are acquainted with someone, and then, as part of your conversation, then you sexually attack them and rape them, that's not rape, according to 61% of Israeli men. That's sick. So, my point is, there's a huge problem in our society. We need to fight it. We need to educate the people. We need to declare a national emergency and say, yes, there is a problem that we need to fix. But instead, it's blame the Africans. Now, this paragraph here was published in Haaretz, a liberal Israeli newspaper that I used to write for. And I'm going to read it out loud to you. In the corners of the living quarters of the Africans, you will find the filth, card games played for money, residents getting drunk, and prostitution. The Africans bring this way of life with them when they migrate, and it's no wonder the crime in the country is on the upswing. Young women and even young men are again not safe going out on the streets alone after dark. Well, the crazy thing about this, it could very easily have been written last week, last month, last year, but in fact, it was written in 1949. Huh? I thought these African refugees, these Habesha people, these Eritreans and Sudanese, they only just came in the last 10 years. That's true. But this article was not about the Africans of today. It was written about the Africans of then. Not these people, it was written about these people. The Jews of North Africa, of Morocco, of Tunisia, of Libya, of Egypt, right? Algeria. The Jews from all of those North African countries, as I said earlier, as soon as 1948, 1949, you have the Jews of these countries being brought to Israel. And many of them were sent to live in South Tel Aviv, the poorest neighborhoods even then of Tel Aviv. And when they arrived, these fellow Jews, this is what they wrote about them in the newspaper, that they're filthy, and they play cards, and they have prostitutes, and that they're violent. So even then, there is anti-African racism even amongst the Jews, okay? And this is what I wanted to explain to you. Every new group of immigrants that came, because then there were more groups, there were the Russian Jews, and the Ukrainian Jews, and this Jews, and that Jews. And it's not only in Israel. We know this from everywhere, from here in Sweden and other places. If you're already in a place, you think you deserve more rights than the people who just came now. This is called nativism, okay? The nativism, the person who is native, who came before, thinks they deserve more rights than the person who came recently. This is one of the ways that people discriminate, okay? So there's nativism, and of course there's white supremacy on top of this. The people who have lighter pigment or less skin pigment think they deserve more rights than the people who have more pigment, okay? But on top of the nativism, racism towards immigrants, and on top of the white supremacy, racism towards black people, we also have another layer of hatred in Israel, and that's Jewish supremacy, which is discrimination against people who are not Jewish, or less Jewish, perhaps. And all of these three layers of oppression combine to create a matrix within which the ones who suffer the worst are the newly arrived black refugees, these African refugees. Now, we're talking about a very small amount of people. Originally, we're talking about 60,000 people in a country of 8 million. Okay, this is less than 1%. If you look at how European nations have accepted immigrants, you will see that this is a teeny tiny fraction of what other countries in the world have had to deal with. But still, even though it's so small, it's still offensive to so many people. And interestingly, I probably don't need to tell you this, as Abyssinian people, but many of those who came to Israel came specifically because they had a positive view. Some had no view, some had no understanding. I didn't know anything about Israel, some people will say, and other people will say, I came to Israel because I thought they would understand our plight, because they suffered through the Holocaust, because they were the people of the Bible who suffered slavery in the Bible. For the Darfuri, for the Sudanese, who went through ethnic cleansing, who went through genocide, they said these Jewish people just went through their own genocide a few decades ago. If anyone in the world can understand what it means to be a victim of genocide and to require safety, it's the Jewish people. And this is why many Sudanese people came to Israel. For many Eritreans, of course, they themselves are deeply invested in the biblical stories, because they're also their stories, their cultural stories. And for many people, they saw, well, these people, just as we are slaves in Eritrea to a regime that enslaves us, these Jewish people understand. They have a holiday, the Exodus, the Passover, Fasika, of once being slaves and now yearning to be free people. So they should understand our experience. So for many people, that's why they anticipated that they would receive a positive response. So for many, it's just a basic respect for Judaism. In some certain cases, it was even willingness to embrace it. Of course, many people were Muslim, many people were Christian, and some atheists. But some people's like, you know what, I want to be Jewish. Or a few people, especially if they married someone. Let's say you came to Israel and you fell in love with a man or a woman, and you decided that you wanted to spend your lives together. In Israel, they don't allow you to get married unless you're the same religion. Okay? Not like in Ethiopian Eritrea, where this is, and any other place in the world, like Sweden. In Israel, they forbid this because they don't want mixed race couples. So this, if you can imagine, in Israel, there is actually an official, a government official, whose job it is to sanction or not sanction religious conversions. What business is of the state? I don't believe in giving power to determine my identity, giving that power over to any religious official, but if you adhere to a religion and you care for that religious official to grant you, official acceptance, that's fine, but what does that have to do with the government? What does that have to do with the people that, stamp my passport? It shouldn't have anything to do, but in Israel, because it's somewhere between an ethnocracy and a theocracy. So there's actually a government official who determines whether someone is allowed to convert to Judaism, the religion, or not. And so Muli Justin, the conversion czar of the Israeli government, he says, the government built a fence on the border with Africa to keep out Africans, and we built one here at the entrance gate to the Jewish people, he says. Here, we are talking about tens of thousands who want to assimilate into us and have no connection to Judaism. That's puzzling to me, because I thought that Judaism isn't racist. This is what I've been told, right? They said, well, it's true. We don't proselytize. We don't actively try to convert new people to join the Jewish people. But, but anyone can. It's true, in Israel, we do give special preferences to Jewish people, but you can't call that racist because anyone can be Jewish. If anyone can choose to become Jewish, then it shouldn't be racist to give preference to a Jewish person. Well, here you have the proof in the pudding that it's a complete lie. Because in those rare instances where a black person wanted to convert to Judaism, to make Judaism their religion, the government forbade it in every single instance. Every African refugee who applied to convert to Judaism was rejected. So again, enough of this garbage lie that It can't be racist because we allow anyone. No, you allow anyone you want to. You don't allow Africans because you're racist as hell. So this is doubly sickening to me, because when we hear about famous musicians and entertainment stars that are mixed race, that have one Jewish parent and one black parent, all of a sudden the Jewish community runs to embrace them. Wow, I'm so proud. You know that cool rapper Drake? He's part Jewish and part black, and wow, I'm filled with pride. That's cool, that reflects on me. That makes me feel good about my tradition, that this cool rapper is half Jewish. So we want to claim them when it's convenient. When Rashida Jones, the daughter of Quincy Jones, excellent actress in her own right, we want to say, oh, that's cool, Rashida Jones is Jewish, yeah, didn't you know that? Lenny Kravitz, the rock star, he's an awesome man, his name is Kravitz, and his father is Jewish, and that, we're like big-upping ourselves for this, that's all good. But when it comes to actual families in Israel, then we don't want to allow that to happen. No, then we want racial purity. So the justice minister at that time, Yaakov Ne'aman, he says the same thing. It's impossible to allow anyone to convert to Judaism. It permits anyone to receive citizenship. Talking about the African refugees. Now, he himself was the richest politician in Israel. He had 100 million shekels to his name. And the reason why I mention that, of course, racism is a reason in its own right, but it turns out that there are other reasons in Israel for trying to exclude Africans from the country. There are other interests at play here, and they are economic. What do I mean by that? So, as you know, again, there's no way that we're going to have enough time to talk about Palestinian issues, and I know we're here to talk about Africans, but just very, very briefly, you understand that for decades, Israel has counted upon Palestinian people to be the grunt workforce of its society, to do agricultural labor, to do construction labor, to do the jobs that many Jewish people did not want to do. And it worked fine for some decades until more and more Palestinian people began to resent their unequal status in the country. And then we have the Intifada, people start resisting. And at that time, the government realizes, well, we might want to find some other group of people to do our grunt work. And so at that time, the government begins to encourage the importation of foreign laborers, mainly from East Asia. So you see bringing in Thai people, for example, to work in agriculture, Chinese people to work in construction, Filipina ladies to work as caretakers for the elderly. Okay? So, if you think about it, this has become an industry, in fact, a very lucrative industry. There are companies that specialize just in getting groups of Asian laborers, bring them to Israel, of course, getting them to sign documents agreeing not to have sex and not to have relationships and not to have families, because we don't want any non-Jewish children in Israel. And we don't want these people to waste any minute of their time engaged in social interactions that should be spent all wiping our parents' asses. So, in this case, we just want them to work. So we sign them under prohibitive conditions in their contracts. These laborers who, of course, want to work in Israel because they can make more money in Israel than they can make at home. They're trying to help their families. Often they leave their families back home. They come to Israel, they pay a fee for the right to work underprivileged life in Israel. And those fees that the companies become quite well off, and of course they line the pockets of politicians. So a politician who makes money off of importing Asian laborers doesn't want Africans in the country, because they're there. An African in the country is going to work. He wants to work. She wants to work. She wants to provide for her family. She wants to survive. So Africans in the country are going to be a workforce. Okay? Now, if there's Africans in the country that are already there, that are willing to work, then we don't need to import people from Asia. And then where will those companies make their money from? And then how will those politicians line their pockets? So another reason besides the racism that many Israeli politicians do not want African refugees in the country is because they can't profit off of continuing to import East Asian workers. This is part of the sixth system, what these refugees are up against. Is this starting to make sense? Okay, I haven't even started talking about the refugees themselves yet. I'm going to start now. So, we are here because of the torture we faced. We're not talking about the African refugee community in Israel. The vast majority of them, about 90% of these refugees, are either from Sudan or South Sudan, or they're from Eritrea. That's who we're talking about. I don't need probably to tell you about Sudan and the leader of Sudan up on crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court for the ethnic cleansings and the genocides that have gone on in his country. I don't need to explain to you why people flee Sudan. And I certainly don't need to explain to you why people flee Eritrea. You see, many people don't know. The exact same man has been in power all these years. I don't need to give you a lesson, but usually when I put this triptych together, people are kind of blown away that a country could be ruled with an iron fist by the same person for so many decades, and that usually explains it enough for them, why people would be fleeing. 63% of people in Eritrea have only ever known this man as ruler. That was a couple of years ago, it's probably higher now. So, again, most people in this room are probably familiar, but just for those who aren't, this is, a map of the region, and I'm just going to focus on the main countries affected and zoom in and explain the origins. So, there has been a migration from Sudan of refugees, mainly to Europe, passing through Libya, but then Gaddafi cut a deal with those European countries. They didn't want to receive so many refugees, and they said, well, we'll buy more oil from you, and you can stop, we'll send you money as long as you stop all these refugees from coming over. And then when that migration route slowed down, then people started going to Egypt. And then from there, from Egypt on to Israel, soon people started following from Eritrea. Now, a lot of Israeli Jews started asking, well, for these Sudanese and Eritreans to arrive in Israel, they had to pass through Egypt. So what's wrong with Egypt? Why didn't they just stay there? Why did they have to come and bother us? And the answer is because when Sudanese refugees went to Egypt and they were in Egypt and they were not receiving the help of the United Nations, they decided to protest, and they went to the United Nations offices in Cairo, and they held a non-violent demonstration. Men, women, children, they just put down their bags and they said, we are here, we are refugees, we need your help, please help us. And eventually the Egyptian police came and they just massacred. Dozens of men and women and children murdered in the streets of Cairo. Okay, in downtown Cairo. So at that point, Sudanese refugees realize that they are not going to find refuge in Egypt, that Egypt is not a safe place for them, that the government in Egypt is tight with the government of Sudan, and if they want to receive refugee status, they will need to find it elsewhere. And that is when they began going to the next country over, Israel. Sadly, if any of you are familiar with Marilyn's work, then you know that many of the people who passed through Egypt in order to get to Israel, the way they traveled through was by human trafficking gangs. And many of those people were tortured on the way, tortured by captors who ransomed them to their family members. Sickeningly, I'm going to show you a very, very disturbing photo.
just so you can see how sick these human traffickers were, what these people had to go through before they even got to Israel. Because on top of the beatings and the electrocutions and the rapes and the gang rapes, these captors, these human traffickers, invented new methods of torture. And one of them would be to take plastic and burn it, and then drip that burning plastic onto the bodies of people, including young children, if you could imagine this. Of course, this has been documented by many mainstream news media. Now, when these refugees passed through the Sinai to get to Israel,
the border looked very similar to the way it must have looked thousands of years ago when the Israelites, according to legends, were crossing the Sinai desert into the land of Israel. It didn't look much different. This is a photograph of the border between Egypt and then Palestine 100 years ago. As you see, there was no fence, and it didn't look so different when these refugees got there. This is what awaited them. Now you see there is barbed wire. It's not fun to have to try to cross barbed wire, but it's also not impossible. It wasn't that much of a challenge to these refugees. This is all that existed. Sometimes they lost a shirt or pants, clothes, but they were able to cross. And all of these refugees, none of them were illegal. Because according to international law, the way to apply for refugee status is to cross the border and then to stand there and wait, not to try to sneak into the country in the interior, but just to enter the sovereign space of the country and declare asylum. And that's what every single one of these refugees did. They crossed the border into Egypt, past that simple fence, and they waited on the border for the Israeli army to come. Sure enough, the Israeli army patrols came, found them, and brought them to army base. On the army base, they were tested to make sure they didn't have any diseases, checked to make sure they weren't terrorists. But once the army was satisfied that there was no reason to fear them, the government sent them to South Tel Aviv, to the poorest neighborhoods of the country. Now, didn't give them any lessons on how to speak Hebrew, didn't explain to them any of the nuances of the country, didn't find them any housing, didn't prepare any food subsidies, didn't give them any aid whatsoever. Just one bus ticket to Tel Aviv, and that's it. And these people who mostly cross the border with nothing but their clothes on their back, find themselves all of a sudden in a brand new country, unable to speak the language, and without any home to speak of, and they arrive at the bus station in Tel Aviv, and they hear, okay, all the Africans are in that park across the street. They walk outside the bus station, and there's a park, and that's where they go, and that's where they sleep. That's their new home. A public park in the middle of Tel Aviv. And so there's a lot of homelessness at first, without any place to live, without any government support, in the heat, in the cold, in the rain, in the snow. Eventually people start organizing. One person is able to pool some money together, and they're able to find an apartment, and then 10 refugees live in a two-room apartment or a one-room apartment, and they squeeze in there, and of course it's not easy. Without any work, they have to, scrape by, and sometimes that means going through dumpsters, sometimes that means finding under the table work in menial jobs, but slowly people pick themselves up and with great difficulty manage to eke out a living. Now, of course, one of the first jobs is, I don't need to tell you, many Eritrean folk have skills in various professions, including welding is something that, metalworking is something Eritrean men are known for sometimes, and of course some of these Eritrean men were then hired by the Israeli government, if you can imagine this, to build a brand new fence on the border. So after they managed to get past the border, the government then employed them to build a fence so that no more of their brethren and countrymen could enter the country. And since the government built this wall, no more refugees enter the country. It's sufficiently strong and stable and secure that it has reduced the immigration to zero. Near zero, maybe a dozen people every year, maybe 10 people will get into the country, but that's nothing, right? It's a handful. Realistically, 99.9% is over. So this is the first time in Israel's history that there's an immigration wave of non-Jewish people. So in order to deal with this, Israel has to create a bureaucracy that did not exist before, a bureaucracy to deal with these asylum applications. So it hires this man named Joel Moss, and like myself, a Jewish man who grew up in Canada. And because he had worked for the Canadian government processing refugee applications in Canada, he thought, well, I've got the experience of doing this kind of work. Israel needs my help, because now Israel, for the first time, is facing a wave of refugees. I will move to Israel and I will help the Israeli government create a refugee infrastructure. And that was his motivation. So he came to Israel and started to create this infrastructure, and then he realized very quickly the government was not interested in actually processing the applications, reviewing them, examining them, questioning them. Is this person in fact a refugee? No? Well, I'm sorry, you don't deserve it. Yes, you are? Okay, you get it. The government wasn't trying to find out what happened to these people and what they deserve to receive. The government was trying to fail them all. The government was trying to create a system in which they would all be rejected. So the man that they brought in from Canada to examine their requests, he himself has come out and said, the Israeli government, it's a sham, it's a joke, it's a pretend, it's a facade, there's no effort, the bureaucracy is just a pretense. And the objective is, this is coming from the man who actually created the whole system. And in fact, that's what happens. First of all, of the refugee applications that African refugees submit, 80% of them are just completely ignored. The government doesn't even read them, doesn't even look at them, doesn't even open them. And of course, of those that it does actually take the time to read and evaluate, 99.9% of them, over 99% of them are just completely rejected. So, in fact, I don't need to tell you, Eritreans applying for asylum in other parts of the world have very high success rates. Of course, the statistic is from quite a few years ago, and not every country has the same record, but clearly in many Western nations, Eritrean refugees overwhelmingly receive refugee status. In Israel, the number is 0. 0 point something percent. Just in the last couple of years, I think 5 Eritreans. Sudanese, okay, so there you have your answer. Less than can fit on one hand all the Eritreans, of all the tens of thousands. Less than 5 have been receiving. Now, of course, it's not like other countries in the Middle East don't take refugees of their own. Okay? It's not that none of the countries in the Middle East are picking up their fair share. As you can see, many countries throughout the Middle East taking in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions. Now, these are old statistics. Since then, Jordan has taken more, Lebanon's taken more. Lebanon has over 1 million refugees now. The percentage of these countries that are refugees is, now, of course, many of them are Syrian refugees, and they're also Arab, and also Arabic speaking. So but that doesn't mean it's not a challenge to absorb a million refugees. Okay, so the point is, Israel's own neighbors on every side are taking in huge amounts of refugees, and it's only Israel that has this record. In fact, Israel leads the world. Israel is number one in the world in the highest rejection rate of refugee status. So you can say Israel is a world leader. Just what it's a leader in is something that, in my opinion, it should be ashamed of. Now, at first, the government gives these asylum seekers temporary papers, which they are required to renew every few months. But then it starts tightening the screws on them, and now they have to renew it every 6 months, and then they have to renew it every 4 months, and then every 3 months, and every 2 months. And of course, it means that people have to take days off work, and there's not enough people working there, and they're standing outside in the heat, and in the cold, and in the day, and in the sun, with their children, and this just goes on, and people start sleeping outside the government offices so they can get a spot in line the next day. These are the kinds of trials that they put people through just to stay in the country. Now, admittedly, there are some humanitarian people living in Israel, some Jewish Israelis. Clearly, you asked earlier about, don't Jewish people feel some sympathy towards other refugees, having been refugees themselves so recently? Well, of course there are some. And in fact, in Israel, if you can imagine this, when these refugees started arriving in the country, soup kitchens, those organizations that are formed, the civil society groups, that their objective was to ensure that poor people don't go hungry, all right? Serving the homeless populations of Israeli cities, they started refusing to serve Africans, okay? They hand out free meals to people who can't afford them, but they didn't want to serve African people. They had a no black people rule. And when this disgustingly resulted, a few Israeli activists said, this is sickening. We need to provide a safety net for these people. So some Jewish Israeli citizens, they established a soup kitchen, Food Not Bombs, an outdoor, in that same public park, right outside the central bus station in Tel Aviv. Some Jewish Israelis started making food every night, nutritious, healthy meals, so that people would just have something to eat. Okay, so that's something that could be said to their credit. And of course, there were groups that formed in order to convince their fellow Israelis not to be intimidated, not to, to internalize this racist discourse. And so you have a campaign that one of these groups put on, advertisement campaign, with posters. When you would walk around the city, you would see posters. Lo zarim, chaverim, meaning not foreigners, friends, where they would take photographs of actual friends, Africans and Israelis who had managed to meet each other and created bonds, and in this way make people realize they're no different from you or I. They're just human people who are recently arrived. And so they put these photographs around the country, but unfortunately it was a voice in the wilderness. It was a single solitary voice, and it was the exception that proved the rule. And the rule was massive racist incitement campaigns, led by Israel's leaders. In this case, the religious leaders. So in 2010, you have dozens of rabbis all across Tel Aviv signing a religious edict, saying that according to God, it is a sin to sell or even to rent an apartment to an African refugee. It's a sin. It's against God to rent an apartment to a black man or woman. And of course, many Jewish Israeli people are secular, they're liberal, they don't follow all the rules of the Torah, maybe they're atheist or agnostic. It doesn't mean that that affects everyone, but there are many people who are religious, and there are many people who are traditional. And for those people, if their rabbis tell them that this is a sin against God, they're going to follow what the rabbi says. And they're going to follow this racist rule. And this actually happens. And many African people are confronted by this, and they're told straight up, no, we're not going to rent you, my rabbi doesn't want me to. So as hard as it is for them to get by, it becomes harder and harder. And of course, after the Tel Aviv rabbis do this, then rabbis all across the country start doing this. And when I say rabbis, I don't mean just someone who is their occupation to administer religious advice. I mean state salarymen. I mean people who receive their paycheck from the government. My tax money pays their healthy salaries. And these chief rabbis of cities all across Israel, hundreds of them, co-signed these religious edicts forbidding Jews from renting apartments to black folks, to Africans, and to Palestinians, for those who thought that they could separate the issues. Now, Netanyahu comes to power in 2009. He comes back, he makes a political comeback, and he becomes prime minister, and he has been prime minister ever since. 2009, he returns to office, and he appoints this man, Eli Yishai, to be his interior minister. And in Israel, interior minister is the position that deals with immigration and migration, and so he is the person who has most control over black people's lives, over refugee lives. And he is one of the most racist leaders of recent years, and the things he says about African asylum seekers, most are Muslims who think the country doesn't belong to us, white men. Us, white men. The stupid part about it is he himself, his family is from Tunisia. He himself is Arab. He is an Arab Jew himself. But white supremacy is such a sick drug that it even convinces, it's a pigmentocracy. It's not just about white versus black. Like I said, it's about how much pigment you have. The less pigment, the more privilege. So he's like, well, maybe I'm not completely white, but I'm white enough that I'm to be not black. So I deserve, so the land is ours. It doesn't belong to those blackies, And he goes on. They bring with them a profusion of diseases, tuberculosis, AIDS, drugs. Until I am able to deport them, I'll jail them and make their lives miserable, he says. And this is the official government policy. Because Israel doesn't want to just collect everyone and deport them all, because then it already has a bad reputation in the world, as we talked about earlier, the United Nations saying Israel is a racist regime. So they're already coming under criticism, so they realize they can't just deport them right back to the tortures they fled from. So they said, okay, our policy is to make their lives miserable until their lives are so bad that they just give up and agree to self-deport. This is the policy of the government, straight from the mouth of the minister. So we see that Eli Yishai is not the only government minister to incite racism against African people. Here we have Miri Regev, the top female official in the ruling party. She's the Minister of Culture. Now, if you can imagine this, there are rallies, race rallies in Israel, in Tel Aviv. We have people marching through the streets, screaming at any black person that passes them by, saying, get out of here, this is our country, leave, you murderer, you rapist. Any black person that passes by, it's like rallies, dozens, hundreds of people marching through the streets, screaming at them to leave. So, at one of these race rallies that I filmed in downtown Tel Aviv, you have politicians coming to make stump speeches. Every politician from the right realizes that if they can jump on this bandwagon, they can win a few more votes, a few more racist votes. And so, at one of these anti-African race rallies in Tel Aviv, you have several politicians from the ruling party give racist speeches. And we have Miri Regev saying the Sudanese, and of course, they are not referring only to people from Sudan. In Israel, Sudanese is a catchphrase for all the Africans. It's because the Sudanese were the first group of African refugees to arrive, because they were the first, so people put that tag on them, Sudanese. So even if you're Eritrean, you're Sudanese. So when she's saying you're Sudanese, she's saying all Africans are a cancer in our body. And when she said this, 1,000 Israelis at that rally ran rampant through the streets of Tel Aviv all night, attacking black people, any black person they saw, man, woman, child. Now, as sickening as that is, I have to admit, she did apologize for it the week later. But Miri Regev did not apologize to African people for calling them cancer. She apologized to cancer victims, Jewish cancer victims, for comparing them to Africans. I kid you not. She said, I apologize, I did not intend to hurt cancer patients. Okay, so this is how sick it gets. After the statement, she incited a pogrom against black people, smashing black people's stores. All of those ministers who spoke at that rally were then, all those lawmakers were promoted. Minister of Science, Israel ambassador to the UN, Minister of Culture, all of these people got promoted in the government. The week later, Israeli newspaper Times of Israel did a poll, and they found that that statement she made, that Africans were cancer, 52% of Israeli Jews agreed with her. And 33% condoned anti-migrant violence. I said that the pogrom that happened that night, that's what they're referring to. A third of Israeli Jews said it was legitimate for people to attack them in the streets. This is what we've come to. And of course, as I said, she and the other ministers who incited that race riot were promoted to become ministers. Now, again, it's not one minister or two ministers, it's throughout. So we have Eli Shai, we have Miri Regev, and we have Netanyahu himself. We hear him saying that Israel is preparing to stop the spread of Ebola to protect from infiltrators. Of course, infiltrators, as I said, that's the catchphrase, one of those catchphrases the Israeli government uses to describe African refugees. In order to demonize them and to dehumanize them in the minds of the people, they call them infiltrators, that they snuck in. No one snuck in, they all presented themselves to the authorities, but this is the idea, to make them out to be terrorists. So Netanyahu, he's trying to, so that in people's minds, they will make this association. They're terrorists, they come with diseases, so we're going to protect from Ebola, and we're going to protect from the African refugees. Now, what is this sick set of comparisons coming from Israeli government top, a female official, top male official? Cancer? Ebola? Why the comparison to death-causing diseases? I guess this has some kind of currency in Israel. I don't know if you know this, but a couple of years ago, it was Obama's birthday, and the top Israeli newspaper decided to conduct a poll, just for kicks, I guess. And they said, what should we as the Israeli people give to President Obama for his birthday? It's his birthday coming up. You know, shouldn't we give him a birthday present? And wouldn't you know it, a plurality of Jews who answered that question, of Israeli citizens who answered this public poll, actually said that 50% of them said that we should give Obama an envelope with Ebola for his birthday. Okay? So what is this connection between black people and death-causing diseases? Where does this come from? Where does this originate? Why is this so common? The truth is, you know, our teacher Malcolm X has spoken about this decades ago, okay? He spoke about how the words are used to create these associations in people's minds. So he talked about how the word Negro in the English language comes from the word necro, all right? That Negro, if Negro is said to mean black, that necro means death. And so the word Negro is already meant to foster an association in people's minds between black people and death. Okay? Now, this is not a new tactic by the Israeli government to associate black people with Ebola and to associate them with cancer. It's a very long, old-school white supremacist tactic, but it's a proven tactic, and so the government uses it. And we see that, as I said, it becomes a popular option to incite racism against black people. So during election season, politicians can campaign on the basis of it. They can advertise how racist they are and remind people, remember how racist I am? That's why you should vote for me again. I'll be just as racist in the future. And so when Netanyahu runs for re-election, he makes as his campaign poster, "Atzirat gal hamistanenim misinah." We stop the wave of infiltrators, African refugees. Vote for the Likud party. Now, the second thing is, it's not only on the national level where this happens, okay, at the national level, understood, but even on the local level. Now imagine if you're walking in downtown Stockholm and you see a poster like this. A man holding his daughter on his shoulders, walking through the park, and the sign says, "To keep those Jews far from my daughter, I'm voting for the Christian Identity Party." If any of you saw such a sick sign, I'm sure you would be disgusted by it. I'm sure you would be revolted by the racism, okay? And in fact, thankfully, this sign doesn't exist, okay? This is not a real sign. I made this up in Photoshop. I took a photograph of a man with his daughter, and I put those words on it. I created this. It doesn't really exist. Not in Charlotte, not in any other city. But this does exist, and it's a real photograph from Israel. Not in Charlotte, but in Charlotte's sister city in Israel, Hadera. And in this election for city council of Hadera, it does say the exact same thing. To keep those Africans from my daughter, I'm voting for the Jewish Identity Party. So even on the local level, people are manipulating the popular hatred of Africans to win votes. This is how potent of a feature this is in Israeli society. It even extends to the commercial sphere, okay? What do I mean by this? So, a couple of years ago, Israelis went to their mailboxes in the center of the country, and they opened it up, and, sometimes you get advertisements from companies, you didn't ask for it, but, they put ads in everyone's mailbox, so you pick up your mail, and with it comes some ads, and there was this advertisement that they saw, "Haftom lebayat hamistanenim." In English, the solution to the problem of the infiltrators. Now, what does this mean? We've already explained that infiltrators means African refugee, right? So if you get an envelope that says solution to the problem of the infiltrators, you assume maybe some political party is trying to put forth a proposal for what the government of Israel should do about this wave of immigrants to the country. But in fact, when you opened up the envelope, it was an advertisement for insect extermination. The solution to the problem of the infiltrators. I've translated it into English for you so you can read it. So what does this mean? I'll parse this for you. It does not mean that these people are saying, you Israelis, you should see African people as insects that need to be exterminated. No, it's not saying that. It's worse than that. Because it's saying, you already believe this. I know in my heart that you already believe that African people are insects that deserve to be murdered. And because of that, I'm going to make a joke implying that, knowing that when you realize the connection, you will find it funny. And because you found it funny, you will then consider hiring my company to provide these insect removal services. So they are counting on people to be racist recognizing that they will be, assuming they will be, banking on it, and hoping that they will see some money out of it, that they will profit from this racism, this racist joke. That's how sick it gets. That's the discourse. Now, of course, it comes from the government. It comes from commerce, and also it comes on the street. Graffiti throughout Tel Aviv. Expel the N-word. This is what people have to deal with on a daily basis. And as I said, we have the anti-African rallies in the streets. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And we have people, Mavet la-Sudanim, death to the Sudanese. And then, as I said, you have the full-on riots where Israelis were running rampant through the streets, stopping buses in the middle of the street. Hey, do you have any Africans on this bus? Stop the bus, stop the bus. Let's get the Africans out here. Let's give it to them. Let's punch them. Let's show them what's what. But this is how they were rampaging through the neighborhood, smashing African cafes and shops and destroying the contents, breaking through the windows of cars, African people driving. This woman smashed a beer bottle over her head while she was holding her baby. Her baby fell to the ground. This is May 23rd, 2012. I'll never forget that night. I was on the street filming, documenting it as it went down. And when it started to get worse and worse and worse, you know, people started attacking me, of course, because I'm filming it. So then when I see a policeman, I'm like, hey, help me, people are attacking me. It's like, sorry, I can't do anything to help you. You should go home right away, because I can't even help you. So, my life changed that night. It was never really the same. It wasn't just one night. It had been happening for weeks leading up to that, but that night, something changed. And I'll never quite forget it. Now, in the days that followed that pogrom, it got so bad that even the African ambassadors to Israel of these 6 countries, they requested a meeting with Israel's foreign ministry. They said, look, we live in your country, okay? We are subject to the atmosphere on the streets. When our wives go into town to do their shopping, they are accosted by people on the street. You have incited so much anti-African racism that when our families are afraid to leave the house. And these are the most privileged black people in the country, the diplomats. Who has more power than them? And they say, we don't feel safe anymore. Now, as I said, the violence is ramping up to the point where a man could be standing at a bus stop and someone just doesn't like the way he looks because he's got brown skin, and they come with a machete and try to lop his whole head off. He puts up his arm to protect him. The man chopped off his whole hand. You know, luckily, doctors have been working at trying to reattach it, and so that, you know, improve his mobility so that he has some control, and, you know, he's recovering. But this is the level of racism. You know the story of Haftom. He was another Eritrean refugee who, because of, you know, the government's stupid policies, he had to, you know, again go to get his documents signed, and so he went to get his documents stamped so he could continue living. And at that very moment that he was at the central bus stop, a terrorist started shooting at Israeli soldiers. Well, there's a terrorist attack, people are shooting at the soldiers in the bus, and so people use the opportunity to take out their hate on African people. This is the video of what happened, okay? This is Haftom. The terrorists started shooting gun in the bus stop, in the bus station. Like everyone else, he's running away. He's crawling on the ground. He's trying to make sure that the bullets aren't hitting him. He's trying to navigate. He's trying to get around, and as he's going around, he's not a terrorist. A terrorist stands up and shoots. A terrorist has a gun. A terrorist is standing there aiming. He's lurking around, trying to get away. No sane person would assume that this man is one of the terrorists. But people saw his dark skin and thought he must be a terrorist because he is of the hated group, he is of the dark-skinned folk, and so while he is crawling away, the security guard comes up and he shoots him. And he shoots him, and he shoots him, and then, once he's shot and lying on the ground, everyone wants to get in on that. Everyone wants to be a hero. Everyone wants to take out their anger. And so they see, a dark-skinned person lying on the ground, he must be the terrorist, and they take chairs and they smash it on him. And then another thing, they take the whole bench, and they smash it over him. And then kicking him in the head. Another person kicks him in the head, and another person kicks him in the head, and another person. And this is all documented on video. And they beat him to death. And when the medics came to try to preserve his life, they prevented the medics from getting to him. So he did not get medical attention in time, and they were not able to save his life. Of course, the people who were caught on camera beating the man to death, he said, "I have nothing to be regretful for. If it happened again, once, twice, 20 times, I would act exactly the same 20 times." This man, also one of those who beat him up, he was brought up on charges because, hey, we saw you on camera beating the man to death. And so they were brought to a tribunal, and the judge declared, quote, that he had acted in a way that is expected of a prison guard to contribute to the positive image of the prison service. So he's actually commending him, saying, the way you beat this man to death, that's a sign of your professionalism. This is how a murderer of black man is treated by the Israeli justice system. Now, I'm sad and sickened to say that Haftom was not the only African refugee mercilessly murdered in the last couple of years. Does anyone know the story of Emmett Till? This black boy? His name is Emmett Till. Now, I understand it may be a little outside your experience. If I was in the United States right now, this would resonate for quickly. It's a famous story in the United States. What happened was that this black teenager, he was a young teenager at the time, he was from Chicago, and he went down to the south to visit his family members, his cousins. And while he was down there, walking down the street, some white people accused him of winking at a white woman or something like that, or flirting with a white woman. And so on the basis of that, they beat him to death, this black boy. They beat him to death so badly that you couldn't recognize him afterwards. His face was like a sack of potatoes. It was mush. Now, just recently, of course, there's no justification to ever do that to anyone. Even if he had flirted, even if this young boy had flirted with this white woman, but it turns out this white woman just now, she was about to die, she felt guilty, and she just now came to the media and reported that she had made up the whole story. She's now like 90 years old or 100 years old or something, and she just now, on her deathbed, admitted he had never even winked at her, he had never even spoken to her, he never flirted with her, nothing. It was just an excuse to beat black people. As sick as the US is today, as much anti-black racism as there is, you have to go back several decades to get to that level of racism. But in Israel, that just happened. So this, I showed you an Eritrean refugee, this is a Sudanese refugee. He was walking in Petah Tikva, it's like a suburb of Tel Aviv, right outside City Hall. How do I even know all this? Because the cameras from City Hall recorded the whole thing. He was walking in front of City Hall. He saw a group of young women. He walks by, they're standing a few feet away from him as far as you are. There's a table here. So he's walking by the table, the women, and he starts talking to them. Hey, how's it going? Whatever. Blah, blah, blah. They're not interested in talking to him. 10 seconds. It's all on camera, so you just watch it and you can see yourself. 10 seconds, he gets the picture. They're not interested. He continues walking. 10 seconds of conversation. That was enough. And a group of boys came up and beat him to death, right outside City Hall. It's all on camera. For an hour and a half, they beat him until he was dead, until you could not recognize his face anymore. His own brother could not recognize him. The only reason that his brother eventually was able to recognize that this was in fact his brother who had been murdered was because he had lost several of his fingers in the ethnic cleansings in Darfur, in the fighting. He was a Darfur refugee, and because in the fighting in Darfur, he had lost several fingers, so because of that, his brother knew, this is in fact my brother. I know what his fingers look like. That was the only way. His face was mush. They had destroyed his face. That is the level of hatred. That all you need to do is say he talked to a white girl, and that's enough for a group of teenagers to beat the man to death. Most Israelis don't even know this story because the newspapers didn't care much to report it. Of course, it's sad when anyone is the victim of violence, but in some ways, it's even sicker when young children become the targets. Young children in Israel are already the targets because since their families are so impoverished, since the government doesn't allow them to fully work and to fully earn their own monies and forces people to work in the black market and garnishes their wages so it has as little money to be able to provide their children for basic services, health services, and care, daycare. So because of that, many children often are, basically stored in warehouses all day while their parents are trying to eke out a living, and lots of kids, packed into a small place, dozens of kids, and it's in the basement somewhere with no lights. And so already children of African refugees have to pay a very high cost because of their parents' inferior status. But if that's not enough, they often become the direct victims of attacks. So if you can imagine this, some of these sick Israelis campaigning to expel all the Africans immediately, they actually walk around downtown Tel Aviv giving condoms to black people. We don't want you in our country, and we don't want your children in our country. We don't want you to have any children. Just like I showed you before about the Jewish Ethiopians whose mothers were forced to get these birth control injections. So it's the same concept. We don't want your babies, so we're going to hand out condoms to give you the message. We don't want you to reproduce yourselves. They just straight up walk up to black people, men and women, and try to hoist condoms on them. Use a condom. No shame. They're proud of themselves. They take these photographs and they upload them to Facebook. Then these same women get meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of the country, in his own office. They are not on the far fringes of society. They are squarely in the center. They are adopted by the highest echelons of power. You think, just when you think you've heard the worst, this man, who's like a top circumciser in the country, you could call him a circumciser to the stars, perhaps. He boasts that he has circumcised the boys of the Israeli president and Israeli mayors and rabbis and ministers. And so in Israel, in order to get a license as a circumciser, you need to work as an apprentice, first of all, with an established professional circumciser. For many, many times, you must stand there right with him, monitoring, checking, learning the process before you can even touch a knife. And eventually, you get to the point where you can perform your own circumcisions. Okay. Now, I guess this man, this circumciser to the stars, decided that he wanted a little more income on the side. And so he decided to, and he was far from the only one, but he was just the most famous of these to do so. And he said, well, I will train you, if you want, to be a circumciser, And guess what? You don't have to go through the process. You don't have to wait months and years of training. I'll let you do it right away. First time out the door. You want it? Just pay me 13,000 American dollars. I'll make you my apprentice. And from day one, you can already get in there at the cutting. You don't have to go through the laborious process of training. We know all this because a man who is a professional journalist, he took a secret camera and he pretended to want to learn to be a circumciser. And so it's all on camera, it's all recorded in Hebrew. And so this man, he says to him, there are the regular Ethiopians and Sudanese. They're worse. They're black like the N-word. Learning from them is the best. Practice on the black babies first. Even though you have no experience whatsoever, you've never done this in your life, you don't know what you're doing, you can practice on the black babies. And then once you get good, then you can, once you're good at it and you won't make mistakes, then you can work on the Jewish babies. This is what they think of black babies. There were some N-word, but now there are immigration police and they don't allow them to reproduce. Why does everyone go to the non-Jews? Because you can make 100 errors. We fix it. I have a needle and thread. Why does everyone do it? Oh, I just wanted to show you. First learn here on the non-Jewish babies, and then we'll be able to do it cleanly to Jews, he says. Even if you make mistakes, you can fix them. They don't even understand what a mistake is. This is how they speak about African people. This is how they do them. They're cannon fodder. Whatever you do, no problem. These are direct quotes. Even if you cut crooked, they won't say anything because they don't understand anything. April 2012, Israeli firebombs an African kindergarten. Firebombs an African kindergarten. This is how even African babies are targeted. And by the way, I should add, the young couple, the Nigerian couple that started that nursery for African babies, the husband, after the firebombing, the government of Israel deported the husband back to Nigeria, and the wife, she has tried valiantly to keep this going, but the government always tries to close down the kindergarten, so she has to keep moving from one place to another place to another place to another place. Meanwhile, despite their hardships, the man who firebombed the African kindergarten, he got off with no jail time. So that way the government gives the message that you will not face any serious consequences for your actions, essentially encouraging people to continue to attack. And of course, the saddest story, perhaps, of Kaku, this family, Eritrean family, was walking in downtown Tel Aviv, and this super cute baby, and that, here she's already a little bit older, but then 1 year old. 1 year old being held by her mother, and an Israeli man walks up to the mother and the baby and stabs the baby in the head with a pair of scissors 3 times. When they caught the man, he explained his reason. I tried to kill her because I hate them. They're black. A black baby. Blacks in general are terrorists. Now, of course, this isn't all Israelis, okay? There's no way that any logical person should walk away from this thinking, all Israelis want to kill African babies. Of course not, okay? That is obviously the act of a psychotic madman. And in every society, there are psychotic people. There are dangerous, violent criminals who have problems that need to be dealt with. But where did he get the idea to hurt an African baby? Because he is constantly amongst
Israelis who are being told by their governments, these people are cancer, they're Ebola, they are infiltrators, they need to be gone. And so this is the guy with it, they are Ebola, they are terrorists, and so this is the message. And so if this is the message, the psycho people are going to learn and target black people knowing they can get away with it because the government is essentially marking the targets for them. Well, the government, after these race riots, decides, okay, we need to solve the problem. And so they hire this man, Arnon Sofer, an Israeli academic, who had already become famous for his plan for Palestinians, in which he said, if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. So that's his plan for Palestinians. So they hire him, of all people, to come up with a plan for Africans. What should be the government policy? And he, in fact, authors a policy. And the government of Israel adopts his recommendations. And among the recommendations are the concentration of the infiltrators. And this is where we see the masks start to come off. Because there's no longer shame with using the same word. Concentration. Okay? And in Hebrew, it's the same word. You can see it in Hebrew and in English. The Hebrew is rekuz. If you look at any Hebrew-English dictionary in the world, in book form, online, in the internet, rekuz is concentration. Machane rekuz is concentration camp. So the government is already unembarrassed to use the same rhetoric. And then the government starts rounding people up, concentrating them. And it does that by raiding areas of Tel Aviv where they know black people are going to be. They're already concentrated in certain neighborhoods, so we know black people are celebrating. One of our brothers, take care. Thanks for coming. So one Sudanese man, against all odds, he was the exception to prove the rule. He was able to get an academic degree in Israel. Okay, he studied, he worked hard, and he actually got a degree, knowing that he was going to have a party that night, knowing that his African friends were going to be there with him to celebrate. That's where they sent in the police to capture as many African people as they could, and they round people up. And of course, if you see someone on the street, he's black, but he looks Jewish, he's wearing a trapping, he's wearing a kippah, a skull cap, and he's got the strings on the side. Let me see your papers. Are you really Jewish? Let me see if you really are. And if you're not, of course, then the idea is round you up. They start rounding people up to the desert detention center that they built called Holot. It's right on the border with Egypt, right on the African border. And so for the last several years, Israel has been rounding up Africans off the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities and taking them down to the desert. And again, the idea is, like the minister said, make their lives miserable. By forcing you to live in this desert detention center, you will become so depressed that you will just give up hope and agree for the government to send you back to Africa. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. Okay? They admittedly give them furloughs. They're allowed in the daytime to walk out of the jail and then walk back at night where they're clocked in. But there's nothing they can do. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's just desert as far as you can see. It's surrounded actually by firing ranges, by army firing ranges. So there's no possible thing that they can do there. They just walk out in the desert and, of course, crappy food so that they can be undernourished, not nutritional value, so they become weaker. And of course, it's freezing cold in the winter. I know we think of Israel as a hot country, and it is, but of course, as you can see, here's Al-Aqsa, here's Jerusalem. It can get quite cold in Israel in the winter, and this is the desert. As you know, the desert is even colder. And with all this, they don't have any heating facilities, they're not allowed to bring in extra blankets or anything. The idea is, in every possible way, to immiserate them, to make them miserable. Crappy food, no help with the heating. Of course, if you can imagine this Israel, the high-tech
miracle country that is able to send teams of medical assistance to every, earthquake and natural disaster, but supposedly they can't provide decent medical services in their own jails. Because again, the idea is to make their lives miserable. So it gets to the point, if you can imagine this, where human rights groups actually had to come to this detention center and on the ground outside the camp provide medical services, because that's how bad the medical services were. The idea, make their lives miserable. So eventually, some people cave. They're just like, okay, I didn't come here to be in jail. Okay, I fled Eritrea because I was jailed for resisting military service. I'm not going to be in jail here. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. Right? I'd better that I die in my home country than live as a slave in this new country that's not even my home. So some people start to take the government's offer. The government bribes them, makes their lives miserable, and says, okay, we'll give you $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 and a plane ticket. And some people take it. And so several thousand, now over 20,000 of those 60,000 Africans, so over a third of the African community in Israel has been ethnically cleansed with this make your lives miserable policy. So people agree to leave. The government starts deporting people. The first group it deports are the South Sudanese. Within 10 days of the deportation, you already have South Sudanese babies who were born in Israel, who spoke only Hebrew, who had never spent one day in South Sudan. These Israeli-born babies were already, within 10 days, dying. These two kids, within 10 days, had already died, because South Sudan was a brand new country. Over half the country had no access to drinking water. The country is in its infancy. It's been pummeled by civil war for decades. And yet Israel insisted on sending them back. These kids, who, whatever they suffered from, it could have been treated instantly in any Israeli hospital. Instead, they sent them back to a country with no infrastructure, and sure enough, within 10 days, you already have children dying. And of course, in the months that follow, we see some of these Eritrean refugees forced to self-deport, forced to leave Israel because they're not Jewish, and then beheaded by ISIS because they're not Muslims. Can't catch a break. Israel kicks them out of the country. They're back in Africa. They're still trying to survive, trying to figure out how to get there. They cross into Libya, hoping to get to Europe, and ISIS captures them and beheads them. So these are the kinds of torture that they're expelled to. Now, of course, Israel does have a liberal component, or a more liberal component of its government. Of course, there's the parliament, there's the government, and there's also the judiciary. Right? There's a balance of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial. So there is a Supreme Court in Israel, and occasionally it's more progressive than the other branches of government. I have a criticism. I say they just whitewash the worst excesses of the government. They take a law that's racist, and they make a little tweak here and a little adjustment there, and they make it a tiny bit less racist, but then they give their seal of approval. So I don't think that the Supreme Court is a bastion of progressive politics, but at least they put the brakes on some of the worst excesses of the racism from the government. And sure enough, with these new laws that the government passes to round Africans into camps, they say, hold on, they did not commit any crime. You may not like the fact that they're in the country, but they haven't committed any crime, so you can't make them suffer that much. You can put them in these detention centers for a year, maximum. After that, you have to release them because they've committed no crime. And so what happens? As soon as the Supreme Court forces the government to start releasing these people, that means that as long as you can hold out for a year, it's a shitty year. It's a crappy year. It's not fun, one bit. You're in the middle of the desert with nothing to do. But if you can survive that 1 year, then ostensibly you can move back to society. And you're still in Israeli society, which is hostile to you, but at least you're not in jail. But as soon as people start being released from this camp, so they can round more Africans into them, then Israeli mayors take it upon themselves
to complete the job. So the government says, you're released from the detention center, you're not allowed to live in Tel Aviv, you're not allowed to live in Eilat, we don't want Africans there, there's already too many Africans there, we want to get them out. And then you have Israeli mayors saying, no. You're not allowed to Tel Aviv, you can't come to my city, we don't want any black people in our city. So you have the mayors of cities in Israel putting police officers at the edge of town, saying, don't allow any of these Africans into the city. And the police are actually stationed at the entrance to the city. I won't allow infiltrators to reach Arad. I ordered city police to augment forces at the entrance to town. I call upon everyone to be watchful. I won't hesitate to call on all residents to fight, is what he says. And he wasn't the only mayor. And we have another mayor, Rafi Ben Shitrit, in the north. That's in the south. In the north, another mayor. I intend to act in every way, with every tool, to prevent the entry of infiltrators to Beit Sha'an. I intend to determinedly lead the removal of the infiltrators that already entered 2 flats in town. Well, by the time he made his announcement, 2 groups of Africans had already found an apartment to live in. That's even those 2. I won't stop until they are kicked out as well. This is the level of hatred. Their presence in town becomes not only illegal, but dangerous. So in this way, we turn Israeli cities into sundown towns. Now, this has already been the case towards Palestinians, but now we didn't say anything about it. And now their fate becomes the fate of African refugees as well. Now, I don't need to tell you about the general tragedy of these people trying desperately to get away, trying to find refuge on the European continent. How many people died at sea? Lampedusa, how many people? How many martyrs? Apparently not enough for the Israeli government, because after that boat sunk into the Mediterranean with almost 1,000 casualties, his response, Israel Katz, top minister in the Israeli government, said, "See how correct the Israeli government policy was? You can give us a compliment." Alright? Now he's saying he wants praise for the racist rules. And this is after the day after learning that 1,000 refugees drowned. Give us a compliment. We were right all along. And as I said, we are in a new phase because the right, the far right, is gaining in power all over the world, right? With Trump in the White House, and in other parts of Europe, the far right is in the ascendancy. So there's no need anymore to pretend that Israel is a liberal democracy, that it follows the rules of international law, that it cares about human rights. So Netanyahu can now openly admit, even in English, before the discourse was only in Hebrew, to just incite racism amongst Hebrew speakers, but still pretend to the outside world that they care. But now, they see, we can get away with it. We can incite racism, we can forbid them from renting apartments, we can round them into camps, no one cares. The media won't report on it, they're afraid. So, I can now be open and honest. He tweets this openly on Twitter. A strong Israel prevents the passage of masses of refugees to Europe. Europe needs to thank Israel for showing the way at the proper, cruel way to treat African refugees. President Trump, after Trump says that he's going to build a wall and he's going to ban Muslims from the country, and he's going to build a wall to protect it, to separate the United States from Mexico, he said, President Trump is right. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success. Great idea. So now, showing how Israel must lead the world in racist policies. Not something to be embarrassed about, but to be proud about. And if that wasn't embarrassing enough, Netanyahu even found a way to increase the suffering in Africa. Not enough to force those who fled Africa to suffer, but on the way, increase the suffering in their home host countries. So, in order to resettle these refugees back in Africa, Israel, on one hand, bribes makes their lives miserable, bribes them, saying, here's a plane ticket and a few thousand, leave the country. But then it also has to bribe those countries. Those African countries have to agree to allow these refugees in. Doesn't give them refugee status, doesn't give them any housing, doesn't give them any remittances, doesn't help them in any way. But just to allow them to walk across the border, Israel still has to bribe them. So how does it do so? Okay. In exchange for taking these black people we don't want, instead of taking these refugees, in exchange, we will give you weapons. And we will give you weapons training. So therefore you can fight more wars and create more refugees. And this is why some young Israeli activists have been protesting. Israel mocheret neshek lerotzchim. Israel sells arms to murderers and expels the victims. And for those who have some historical knowledge about Israel's relationship with the African continent, it must be said that this is not a new story. Israel has long been selling weapons to African nations, and even in Rwanda, even when the genocide was ongoing, and even when the world knew about it, even then the Israeli government continued to permit the sale of weapons of war to the very militias carrying out the genocide in Rwanda. Israel has a horrific record in Africa, and instead of repairing that record and atoning for that record and doing justice and historical justice by these people, it spits in their faces and shit down their necks. And so, the last thing I want to tell you before we end this presentation, I know that it's a sad, sad story, and I can't promise that you're going to walk away with a better feeling, but I thought it important that you know the severity of the problem. I also want you to remember that Africa is an amazing place. I've had the privilege of traveling throughout Africa. Of course, there's over 50 countries in Africa. I've only just seen small fragments, but I have spent several months in various countries, north, south, east, and west. And to anyone who spends any time there, it's obvious that the media representation of Africa is very different than actual Africa. And one thing that's very obvious to people is how rich the continent of Africa is. How many resources are located there. Not just human resources, the people of Africa, but the land's resources. It is such an abundant, fecund continent. There is so much life there, and yet those resources continue to be extracted for the benefit not of Africans, but people outside the continent, off the continent. In Israel, they grow no sugar. Okay? Chocolate is not grown in Israel. All right? No coffee beans are raised in Israel. Other things that don't come from Israel are gold and diamonds and those minerals that go into your cellular phones. All of those minerals from the ground and plants from the earth that are in great demand in Israel are all from Africa. If the government of Israel does not want African people, then it should not have African goods. It should not be able to eat chocolate with ease. They should not be able to drink their morning coffee. They should not be able to add sugar to their foods. They should not be able to wear gold and diamond jewelry or talk to each other on cell phones with these African minerals. If the government of Israel wants to boycott Africans, then Africa needs to boycott the government of Israel. That's only fair. Now, that's a very controversial statement, but the act of doing so, while it remains controversial, there are those who have managed to find the courage to do so. I'm thinking specifically of the great singer Whitney Houston, who a few years ago, before she passed, she decided, as she went through a religious Bible of her own, and came to the Holy Land to do a pilgrimage, and to be baptized in the River Jordan, and visit other churches around the country, and including the African communities in the country. And while she was there, of course, naturally, the government of Israel wanted to take advantage of this opportunity for PR purposes and arrange a photo op in which she would be photographed with the leader of the country, the butcher of Sabra and Shatila, Ariel Sharon. And when he came up to her and he held out his hand on camera to shake it, she refused to shake his hand. Now,